Sing, be happy today. Please be seated. If you're following along the book, number 307 will be the invitation song. 307.
Chapter 11 today. It's proven to be a message for sermon topics. Jesus, in his life, often did things that caused astonishment and amazement in the people around him. There's a Greek word that's often translated marvel. I want to show you some verses from the life of Jesus in Luke already that we've seen, where they were amazed, astonished, they marveled. When he went to the synagogue in Nazareth and they gave him a book to read, and the scroll of Isaiah, after he spoke, it says all spoke well of him and marveled at his gracious words that were coming from his mouth. And they said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" They were amazed at the way he talked. After he calmed the storm, the disciples who were in the boat with him were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, "Who then is this that he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him?" Imagine that, how they were astonished at that, how they marveled. When he cast a demon out of a small child and restored him to his father, we're told in chapter 9, after that all were astonished at the majesty of God. This is all the same word, and that same word is in our passage today. Jesus calls someone again to marvel, to be astonished, but not in a positive way. He calls someone to marvel in shock at what he did, and it was simply by eating without first washing. We see this in chapter 11, verse 37 beginning. While Jesus was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So he went in and reclined at table. The Pharisee was astonished. That's that same word I was just showing you. Astonished to see that he did not first wash before dinner. Astonished. The same word that was used of the disciples when they saw that Jesus could speak and calm the storm. That same kind of amazement. But in this case, not in awe of how his majesty and power and what, but in this case, astonishment in the sense of being shocked by something that to us we wouldn't think twice about, perhaps. Eating without washing first. Even if you're one of those people that faithfully every time wash your hands before you eat, that's good, that's fine. But if you saw someone who didn't do that, you might wrinkle your nose at it, but you wouldn't be astonished. You wouldn't be just shocked. To help us understand why they reacted that way and Jesus' response and the lessons we can learn, I want to help us kind of put ourselves in the culture of the day. So we can sort of join in this setting there at this mealtime and understand perhaps where this Pharisee was coming from. Because if we understand where he was coming from and why he was shocked and appalled and amazed, then we can see some lessons that we can learn for ourselves. So in the ancient world, it's very common that they would wash before they ate. You might think, well, yeah, but perhaps it was even more important to them for some practical reasons. I've got a little book on manners and customs of the Bible lands. It was my grandfather's. And I was reading through it, and it talks about mealtime and how different it was in their day for us. For one thing, commonly, this is how they would commonly eat. You would all sit down together around a little mat, and then you would have some food there. And generally, the food was in one main dish. If you had, you might have two dishes. It just depends, of course, on what you were having. But you didn't have everybody their own plate. So you didn't serve yourself typically, and then sit there and eat. And you didn't use spoons and forks normally. People ate with their hands. So in describing how they did this, it was common in that part of the world, they would have a flatbread. And you would tear off a piece of the bread and you would kind of curl it up into something you could scoop with. And that would become kind of like a spoon, kind of like something that you could take some of the broth and soak it in there. Jesus talked about that at the Last Supper. He supped with Judas. You could take that and you could use it to scoop up some of the food and you could eat it, like that. And then you would get another piece in. But everybody is eating with their hands and everybody's eating out of the same bowl. So for practical reasons, you could see why perhaps it'd be one thing if you were, even now, if somebody sat down to eat and they did or didn't wash their hands, you might think, well, I don't care about that person, right? Because everybody has their own little plate and fork and spoon. But imagine eating something where everybody's hands are in the same thing and you notice that one of the people there who's reaching in hasn't washed their hands. That might give you some pause. Even today we might think like, that's a little bit off-putting. But that wasn't really the real reason here. In fact, I don't even know if they thought as much about that as we do, in the sense of they didn't understand germs and all that. That didn't enter into their minds. And also, interestingly, this is one of the occasions in our passage where it says Jesus reclined at table. The other way this is the most common way they would eat. On formal occasions, either wealthy people or for special meals, a special supper, they would sometimes recline at table, which is where they had a low table and they would kind of prop themselves up around it. And that was another way that they would dine. It was a Greek way that passed on to the Romans and then eventually to the Jews as well. And we see that in this case, Jesus was reclining at table. But still, from what I understand, that was it would have been eaten the same way. Much more important to the Jews than some simple matter of the fact that we're all sharing in the same dish was their tradition. To really understand this, look over at Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7. While you're turning, I'll tell you that in this same little book about customs and manners and habits of their, of course, they didn't go have a bathroom with a sink like you think of, and running water, but you would have a servant, and if you had a servant, it would be the servant's job to take a pitcher of water, and they would pour it over your hands. So like this, they'd pour some, and you would rinse your hands, and it would be caught in a basin. And sometimes the basin had a lid on it it was kind of sunk in a little bit with holes, and the water would fall in that and drip through into the container below. That way you didn't have to see the dirty water. It would just kind of disappear out of sight. Kind of neat if they would do that. And if you happened to be somewhere and you did not have a servant around, and you weren't at that standard of living, you would do that for each other. So I would perhaps pour the water for you, and you'd wash your hands, and then you would pour the water for me. That's, if you're, I thought it was just an interesting little insight, trying to kind of, again, put ourselves there in their world and understand that. In Mark chapter 7, beginning in verse 1, now when the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who'd come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes ask him, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? Okay, so you've got practical considerations aside. The much more serious thing that's going on here is there was tradition at play. We understand tradition, and tradition is a part of every culture. It's part of what makes culture is tradition. And everybody's got traditions. You have family traditions, and we have church traditions. We have, U.S. traditions, and those are just part of life. But when they say tradition, they're meaning something much more serious than the way we use the word. Because the Jews would take the law that was given to them, and then they added to it their official interpretations and their views, and this was the teachings of the fathers. It was passed down by word of mouth for a long, long time. It was eventually written down in what we call the Talmud. But before it was written down, it was just something that was taught. And it was taught mainly by rabbis, who was just another word for teachers. So the teachers would have little schools of students, and then they had been taught by the rabbis before them, and they had been taught by the rabbis before them. And so they understood this is how we do this, and this is the tradition that we have. And a lot of it sprung out of the law itself. It started with some principles from the actual law, but it grew and grew over time as they kept adding these interpretations that became what they call their traditions. So, for example, two principles from the law that relate to this washing. Of course, the law of Moses doesn't say you have to wash before you eat. That wasn't in the law. That was their tradition. But it was based on some principles. For example, 22 is the golden laver or the basin that was, I said golden, bronze, that was designed to be placed in front of the tent of meeting. And the priests were instructed that whenever they go in there, they had to wash their hands and feet. In fact, it was important that they do that so that they would not die. They had to wash with water. Anytime they were going to come into the altar to offer an offering, if they were coming in there to sacrifice, they had to first wash their hands and feet so they may not die. It shall be a statute to them forever, to them and their offspring throughout the generations. Well, it is said that after the temple was destroyed, so when they went away into Babylonian captivity and the temple was destroyed, that the leaders of the people took this principle, but they applied it to the home. So whereas the priests were required before they entered into the tabernacle to wash their hands and feet, before they went in there to offer sacrifices, they applied that to, well, shouldn't all Jews everywhere kind of do the same kind of thing in your house? Wash your hands and feet before you eat, or wash your hands before you eat. That was part of their tradition. Of course, that's not what the law says, but they added that to that. Another principle was that they weren't just worried about, of course, having some dirt on your hands while you eat. There was this whole idea in the law of Moses about being defiled. You might have noticed that in Mark 7. It said they ate with defiled hands, that is, unwashed. To be defiled had a special meaning to the Jews because there's a huge chunk of the law that has to do with clean and unclean. And if you come in contact with things that were unclean, which could be a host of things, then you became defiled until you could wash. So as an example, things that swarmed were unclean, and that includes a whole lot of stuff. And if you touch something that was swarmed, or something that swarmed that was dead, you were unclean until evening. Anything on which they fell when they died should become unclean, whether it's an article of wood or garment or skin or sack, any article for any purpose, it shall be put into water and be unclean until evening, then it shall be clean. So they had a special, when we think of unclean, we're thinking of microbes, right? When you think of unclean, you're thinking of bacteria and germs and things that might make you sick, maybe. That's typically where our minds go. But their minds went, when they thought of unclean, it was like a unclean in the sense of the law, unclean, ceremonially unclean. And if you had come in contact with any of this stuff, you were unclean. So to eat with unwashed hands, they figured you were unclean and you would defile yourself. Remember, Jesus would respond on another passage with, it's not what goes into a man that defiles a man, but what comes out. But they had this idea that you could become unclean and defiled by eating with unwashed hands. That's not what the law said. That was their interpretation. Now, you have to understand that in their minds, in tradition, these interpretations became traditions. That's the way it's done. The fathers passed it to the children. The rabbis passed it on from generation to generation. They became so attached to their traditions that they actually said it's more important to obey the tradition than the law. I've got a quote from the Talmud. This is when they started writing all this down, which was about 200 years or so after Christ. They started kind of, from what I understand, actually setting it into writing instead of just passing it down. So this is a paragraph from the Talmud. My son, be careful to fulfill the words of the sages. That was the fathers, the ones before, the wise people, rabbis. Even more than the words of the Torah, which is, of course, their word for the law of Moses. For the words of the Torah include positive and negative commandments. Even with regard to the negative commandments, the violation of many of them is punishable only by lashes. Whereas with respect to the words of the sages, anyone who transgresses the words of the sages is liable to receive the death penalty, as it is stated, whoever breaches through a hedge, a snake shall bite him, taking hedges to refer metaphorically to decrees. Here's what they say, the law of Moses, you should pay attention to that. But if you broke the law of Moses, depending on what you did, maybe the worst thing would happen is you get whipped. But, as we all know, if you violate the words of the sages, the rabbis, the wise old men, if you go against them, you're liable to the death penalty. So it's more important to be sure you stay in line with the traditions than even obeying the law of Moses as it's written. They put a higher premium on their interpretation than even the law itself. As an example of this, from the same chapter, same section of the Talmud, there's a story to illustrate this about a particular rabbi. They told this in the thing. Wouldn't all fit on the screen. Let me give you the backstory to this. It says one of the rabbis, Akiba, was once imprisoned by the Romans, okay? And he had a servant named Joshua. And he was an old man. He was a, rabbi, older guy. But they would give them some food and water every day while he was imprisoned by the Romans. And from that water, they would wash and they would drink. It was their water for the day. Well, one day they gave him the water, and the guards noticed that they had a little, what they thought was too much water. And they said, "Why do you need all this water? Are you trying to undermine the prison? Like you could kind of soak the ground or something with it." And they thought, maybe you guys are up to no good. You don't need all this water. So they poured out half of it. And they gave him just a little bit of water for the two of them. And so when Joshua comes and reports this and explains to Akiba what happened while they poured out the water, this is what follows next. When the latter, that is this servant Joshua, told all that happened to Akiba, he said to him, "Give me some water to wash my hands." Joshua responds, "It will not suffice for drinking." The other complained, "Will it suffice for washing your hands?" "What can I do?" the former replies. For this is what Rabbi Akiba says. "For neglecting the words of the rabbis, one deserves death. It is better that I myself should die than that I should transgress against the opinion of my colleagues," the other rabbis. It was related that he tasted nothing until the other had brought him water wherewith to wash his hands. So even in a Roman prison, this is the illustration they used to show the point. Even in a Roman prison where there was not enough water and you had to choose between having water to drink or water to wash your hands, the rabbi said, "I'm not going to eat unless I can wash my hands, even if that means I don't have anything to drink." Because, as we all know, if you go against the interpretations of the rabbis, that you're worthy of death. It'd be better to die than to break these traditions. Yeah. So when you understand that, doesn't it make it more sense now? Bring yourself to Jesus' day. By the way, I read about this guy, Akiba. He was born in 50 AD. So he lived just, in the same time after Jesus, but in that same time period. And this was his attitude toward A, washing hands, and B, the tradition of the fathers. So if in the minds of the faithful Jews, the rule enforcers, the Pharisees, it would be better to die than to break the tradition of the fathers, which included, of course, washing your hands before you eat. Imagine Jesus coming into this guy's house and not even bothering to wash, just sitting down and grabbing some bread, and he starts to eat. And now perhaps we can understand why the man marveled. He was astonished. Because it wasn't just that he was doing something that maybe some people find unclean in a sense of, from a practical point of view. It wasn't just that he was not doing what people typically do, but he was breaking the tradition of the fathers, which was held up to be as or more important than actually the law of Moses. So what does Jesus say in response to this? Of course, the man doesn't say, he's just astonished. Jesus reads his heart and replies in verse 39. The Lord said, "Now you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness." Okay, so it's the context of washing, and Jesus uses the parable of washing a dish. Now this is something that kind of make your skin crawl or make you kind of cringe, right? But I think we've probably all experienced it. Have you ever had a bowl or a cup and you didn't find out till you were finished? Yeah, like you drink the last of it and then you realize, like, oh no, this thing was not clean. Like you can it's disturbing. I know, I'm seeing faces. It's gross, right? To realize, like maybe the outside of it looked good when you got it out of the cabinet, you weren't paying attention, but then as you're eating, you realize, like, oh no, this thing didn't get cleaned. There's like stuff in here. And we're all just like disturbed by that, right? You would hate to be drinking something and realize the cup you're using is dirty. Who cares if it's clean on the outside? What we care about is it clean on the inside where the food is that I'm going to be eating? That's more important than if it's got something on the outside. I mean, you'd like it to be clean all over, but what's really important, but what Jesus shows is you guys just tidy up and clean the outside, but inwardly You're nasty and gross. You're full of greed and wickedness. The Pharisees were told later in Luke 16 that the Pharisees were lovers of money. One of the problems that they had a lot of problems, and Jesus calls them out for all of them. But one of the things that their problem was they love money. And so they had greed. Inside, there was greed. Inside, there was wickedness. But they were sure careful to keep the outside of that cup sparkling clean so that it looks good on the outside to everybody else. But what Jesus could see, what God sees, is what's on the inside. And so he says in verse 40, you fools, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? In the Old Testament, a fool is sometimes associated with one who says there is no God, right? The fool has said in his heart there is no God. It's foolish to ignore God. But by their actions, they were sort of acting like there's no God. Because if you just clean up the part that everybody on earth can see, but you leave the part inside defiled and nasty, are you not ignoring the fact that God made both the inside and the outside and he can see what's going on? So to live that way is to really disregard the reality of God and to only be thinking about what people see and not thinking about what God can see. And so that is a very foolish thing to do. Jesus says in Matthew 23:5 that the Pharisees did all their deeds to be seen by others. And he warns against this in Matthew 6. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. The Pharisees were very, very concerned with the outside of the cup, with what everybody else could see, being mindful of how it looked to the world, how it looked to other people, so that people would be impressed with them and think they're wonderful and great. But they didn't take any thought, and they did not address the inward man, and Jesus could see that, and God can see that, and Jesus is calling this man out for his hypocrisy by being upset and only thinking about the outward part. In verse 41 of our text, he says, but give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. That first phrase is a little difficult. Give as alms those things. So to give alms was to give to the poor. And he's saying, give those things that are within. One interpretation I read of that is that it means when you help someone, don't just do it for show, but do it from the heart because you're moved with compassion and you care. Because I'm motivated by love, not just motivated by putting on a show. But it actually reads a little different. It says, give those things that are. So in other words, give of yourself, give from what's inside. But whatever the meaning specifically, it's clear that he's saying, if you address what's going on inside, then you'll be clean. Everything will be clean. You need, and he would say in Matthew's account, he says, first wash the inside, and then the outside will be clean. Like if you take care of the inward man, if you address these inward qualities, if you get things right in your heart, and then you won't have to worry about how things are on the outside as much. But to do what they were doing, which is the opposite, just practicing a surface, superficial religion, that's being a hypocrite. The story continues, the lunch conversation or dinner conversation continues, but I think we'll stop there to make some applications of this because there's several things that we could think about. The Pharisees are the bogeymen of the gospel stories for the most part. They're always getting blasted. And the thing is, we don't want to be like the Pharisees, but also I think there's always a tendency that we could become like the Pharisees if we're not on guard against that. We could easily be like this guy. And we don't want to do that. So let's see what we can learn about that. First of all, this idea of the hedges is something that we need to be careful about. They put a hedge around the law, is the way it's described. Whatever the law was, they tried to add their layer of protection around it with all of their interpretation and rules. And that was kind of seen as making a protection around the law. One of the laws of Moses that they pointed to as to support this whole notion is in Deuteronomy 22. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet, which is like a little guardrail, around your roof, that you may not bring guilt of blood upon your house if anyone should fall from it. So they interpreted that to mean, just like you need to put a little railing around your roof, we need to also put a railing around the law. That's kind of strange. That's a big leap, some of these interpretations. I meant to point out in the other one, did you notice it says, whoever breaks through a hedge, a serpent will bite him? That's straight out of Ecclesiastes. Whoever digs a hole will fall into it, and whoever breaks through a wall, a snake will bite him. That's what it says. And they took that to mean whoever violates one of our traditions is worthy of death. So you can see they're being really, really loose with their interpretations of this. But their thought was, okay, wherever the law is, we need to put a hedge around it to prevent anybody from possibly breaking it. An example of this from modern day Jews, that's fascinating. There's so much of this, but I'll just pick one. There's an interesting law. It's repeated 3 times. And the law says, you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Interesting law. It's 3 times in the law of Moses. Don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Okay? I don't know why you do that anyway, right? I'm seeing some funny looks. But apparently some people were doing that, and the Jews were forbidden from doing it. So here's how they built the hedge around that. They decided at some point, as history goes on, and interpretations were added to it and traditions, that you shouldn't cook any meat in any milk. Okay? So the law says don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk, but then they said, okay, well, probably we shouldn't cook any meat in any milk, right? Then it kept going from there to where modern day Jews who are practicing the halacha, whatever, like the ones that are actually trying to live by all these rules. Not all modern day Jews do that, but there are some who do. Their interpretation of this is that you should wait at least an hour, and some say up to 6 hours after eating meat before drinking milk. Because the meat and the milk will end up in your stomach together, and that's basically what the law is. So, in order to not violate this, you should not consume milk and meat at the same time. And you shouldn't have the milk in your stomach when the meat's in your stomach too, because that's... So you see what happens though is you start with a law, and then they started kind of like adding these layer upon layer upon layer of interpretations until they come up with something that's a long ways away from what the law actually says. Let's turn over to Colossians chapter 2. Do we have a tendency to do this? I think we do. I think it's a human thing that you say, okay, well, like let's say this is the law, and the law says don't go up past this line. And so we look at that, and it's like imagine a cliff there, and if you go over that, you're going to die. So we don't want to get close to the cliff, and we know that's dangerous. So what we do is we say, well, we're going to come back over here and put a guardrail, right? So we're going to build a guardrail, but 10 feet away from that cliff, and say we're not going to even get close to that because if you get over there, you could fall and die. So we're going to back it up over here, and we kind of move the regulation. Now, that might be a good practice in the sense that there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with saying, I don't want to even get close to that. So I'm going to stay far, far away. That's a good thing, perhaps, as far as it goes. But the problem becomes when we take our extra layer of protection and we say, now this is now the law, right? This is now the law that everybody has to go by, because if you go beyond that, you're getting too close to what the law actually forbids. And there is a tendency, I think, to do that and to take our interpretations of that and then to try to enforce that on other people. Paul warns against this. In Colossians 2, down in verse 20, he says, if with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you're still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, referring to things that perish as they are used, according to human precepts and teachings? These indeed have an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. It turns out, oddly enough, that trying to make these new rules, man-made rules, aren't really an effective way of keeping people from sinning. You would think it would be, right? Well, if the law says don't do that, I'm going to put up a post over here, and that way I'll be sure that nobody ever sins. Well, actually, it's not really effective regardless. But it's not our place to make rules. It's not our place to make laws. It's not our place to move the goalposts. It's not our place to kind of expand and say, well, if God says don't do that, then you shouldn't even get over here. That's not our place, but it is a human tendency. It's probably motivated from a good place. It comes from a desire to not do the wrong thing and to help other people not do the wrong thing. But we're not the lawgivers, and it's not our place to make up rules and to enforce our interpretations that are stricter than what the law says, as if we are speaking for God. But I think we have a tendency to do that, so we need to be careful. Another thing is to beware of traditions. Look at verse 8 in Colossians 2. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy, by empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. We all have traditions, and I think we would probably never say out loud, it's more important that you follow my tradition than even the law of God. The Jews actually wrote that down. That's amazing. I mean, somebody actually took the thought to put that on paper. We would probably have enough sense to never say that. We might actually think that sometimes, though, if we're not careful, where our traditions become so ingrained that that's what we notice when someone's going against the tradition, and we think like, oh, no, like that's some huge thing. But we're not traditions are not the law of God. At least traditions that we make up, human traditions, are not God's law. We need to be careful about enforcing those. I was trying to think of some examples. Of course, you know, we have all kinds of traditions. And traditions aren't necessarily bad. You can't get away from them anyway. You'll never get away from tradition. If you decide to throw all the traditions away, you just start making new ones. That's what would happen. Like, it's just the way it is. But one that came to my mind actually is went from my early days of preaching. This will sound strange to the young folks. You won't believe this is true. Old folks will remember this. When I first started preaching in college days, there was churches where it was actually controversial, and you would be looked at really weird if you did not use the King James Version of the Bible. Anybody remember that? I only see a couple of nods, but I know that's true. I remember that. So my first preaching Bible was a King James Bible. I have it at the house. I love the King James. And I mean, it is a beautiful translation. I've memorized a ton of scriptures from it, and I have no problem. I like it a lot. But there were people that if you use something else, you would be looked at with suspicion, like you're not using what's sometimes called the authorized version. The way it's abbreviated is AV. If you ever see AV, it means the King James is the authorized version. And there are people who believe that it was given to us by God. Literally. There's people that teach if you use something else, you're wrong. I mean, there's people that make this a matter of right and wrong. Not so much people that I've encountered in the church, but there are people you can find online for sure that are taking that position and taking it strongly. But I've been places where they would look at you kind of funny if you read out something else. And I remember, old folks, remember, if you prayed and didn't use thee and thou and thine, people looked at you funny. Does anybody remember that? Like, it was expected that if you're talking to God, you need to use these pronouns. And a lot of our songs, several of the ones we sang this morning, use those pronouns. And we have half our songbook or more. I am thine, O Lord, I have heard thy voice, and it told thy love to me. And that's great. I love it. It's beautiful. It's nothing wrong with any of that. And if you'd like to pray that way, that's fine. It sounds regal and beautiful. But to say that's the way you have to do it is taking our tradition and then turning it into some kind of a doctrine. There is nothing in the Bible that says that you have to use those particular pronouns. It's just, it grew out of tradition because that's just the way it had been done for centuries. And it became so normal to us that we couldn't imagine that anything else was okay. And that's kind of changed quite a bit. You don't hear it as much anymore. I mean, people still pray that way and we still sing those songs, but I'd never get the sense that anybody thinks, poorly of somebody who doesn't do it that way. Those days have kind of changed. That's just an example of how it's easy to become ingrained in the way it's always been, and then we begin to think that's the way it's got to be. But we should be careful about enforcing tradition. And then finally, we don't want to ever just practice this superficial, surface-only religion. The Pharisees were so concerned about what everybody else could see. And so when you think about what are the things that are visible, well, it's like how, it's all things that are external. And things like, assembly, which is important. But that's something, it would be easy to, if we were to fall into just an external, superficial Christianity, I think it would look like this. You would dress the part, and you'd show up and be where you're supposed to be so that nobody thought badly of you, but neglect completely what's going on in your heart and be filled with greed and, evil thoughts and not have a love for man and a love for God, but to put on a pretty good show for everybody and nobody would be the wiser. That would be a pretty easy trick to pull off. All you'd really have to do is just show up and not rock the boat, and probably everybody's going to think you're just fine. But here's the thing that people can forget that Jesus reminded this man of: the same God that made the outside of you made the inside of you, and he sees what's in your heart. And that's actually more important to him than all these external things. First, focus on the weightier matters, the things that are in your heart. Get that right, and you won't have to worry so much about trying to keep up appearances and these external things. So don't fall into the trap. That's what the Pharisees fell into, this superficial, external, man-oriented kind of religion, which Jesus just calls them out over and over and over for, instead of thinking about and really